Dead men cannot pour coffee. That was the only thought crossing my mind as I watched Marcus standing in his widow's kitchen, perfectly healthy and wearing the shirt my husband bought him 1 week ago. My husband nearly passed out crying at his funeral. Yet here this dead man stood. In that horrifying second, I realized my flawless marriage was actually a bloody stage play waiting for its final curtain. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Aurora Bennett. It had been exactly 14 days since the funeral. 2 weeks of heavy, suffocating sorrow that seemed to drain the color from the entire world. I still remembered the agonizing chill of that rainy morning, the way the black umbrellas formed a dark sea of mourning, and the sound of my husband weeping uncontrollably beside the open grave of his best friend. Marcus was gone, supposedly taken by a sudden and tragic heart failure, leaving behind a grieving widow and a shattered circle of friends. I felt an overwhelming sense of duty to check on his wife, Elena. She had retreated to their secluded wooden cabin deep in the dense pine forests bordering the edge of the county, far away from the prying eyes of sympathetic neighbors. I spent my entire morning preparing her favorite roasted chicken and a heavy casserole, packing the warm containers carefully into the passenger seat of my car. The drive took me almost 2 hours, winding through narrow dirt roads where the towering trees blocked out the afternoon sun. As I pulled my car onto the gravel driveway, an eerie, unsettling silence washed over me. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, almost unnatural. There were no birds singing in the canopy above, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I turned off the engine, and the sudden absence of mechanical noise made the silence even more deafening. Gathering the heavy bags of food, I stepped out into the crisp, cold air. Every crunch of gravel beneath my boots sounded like a gunshot in the absolute stillness. I walked slowly toward the front porch, feeling a strange knot tightening in the pit of my stomach. The wooden steps groaned softly beneath my weight, sounding like a warning I was too naive to understand at the time. I balanced the containers in one arm and raised my free hand to knock on the thick oak door. Before my knuckles could even touch the wood, I noticed the heavy brass handle was slightly turned. The front door was unlocked, swaying open just a fraction of an inch, inviting the cold draft inside. I hesitated for a moment. Perhaps Elena had simply forgotten to lock it in her haze of deep grief. I nudged the door open with my shoulder. Stepping into the dim hallway, the air inside smelled of pine wood, damp earth, and something unexpectedly comforting: freshly brewed dark roast coffee. I was about to call out her name when a sudden sound froze the breath in my lungs. Laughter. It was a deep, rich, and painfully familiar laugh echoing from the kitchen at the end of the hall. It was not the sound of a grieving widow finding solace in a fragile memory. It was the vibrant, carefree sound of two people sharing a wonderful joke. My confusion morphed into a cold, creeping dread. I placed the food down silently on a hallway table and moved toward the archway leading into the kitchen. I stepped through the wooden frame, and my entire reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. The world seemed to stop spinning. The air grew thick and completely unbreathable. Standing right there, bathed in the golden afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window, was Marcus. He was not a ghost. He was not a trick of the light. He was standing casually near the marble counter, completely alive, perfectly healthy, and pouring steaming coffee into 2 ceramic mugs. He was wearing the exact same navy blue flannel shirt my husband had purchased for him as a birthday gift just 1 week before his supposed death. I stared at the steady stream of dark liquid pouring from the glass pot. Dead men cannot pour coffee. That single thought looped endlessly in my paralyzed mind as I tried to process the impossible image unfolding in front of me. I must have gasped, or perhaps the sheer weight of my presence finally broke the spell. because both of them turned their heads toward the doorway simultaneously. The color drained from Elena's face instantly, transforming her from a relaxed woman into a pale, terrified statue. Marcus flinched violently. The glass coffee pot slipped from his hands, crashing onto the ceramic floor tiles in a massive explosion of hot liquid and broken glass. The sharp noise shattered the remaining silence, but none of us moved to clean it up. We were trapped in a horrifying standoff. Elena was the first to break the heavy tension, her voice shaking violently as she scrambled for words. She stepped in front of Marcus, holding her hands out toward me in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Aurora, wait, let me explain," she stammered, her eyes darting frantically around the small room. "This is not what you think. This is not Marcus. This is Matthew, Marcus's secret twin brother from Europe. He arrived last night to help me with the estate. We kept him a secret to protect the family reputation. It was the most absurd, disjointed lie I had ever heard. A secret twin brother who shared the exact same scar above the left eyebrow, the exact same posture, and the exact same booming laugh." But in that split second, a primal survival instinct roared to life inside my head. If they were capable of faking a death and orchestrating a massive funeral, they were capable of absolutely anything. If I challenged them right now, isolated in the middle of a dense forest miles away from civilization, I might never leave this cabin alive. I forced my facial muscles to relax, painting a mask of stunned but gullible relief across my face. I let out a trembling breath and placed a trembling hand over my chest. "Oh my God," I whispered, injecting just enough fake shock into my wavering voice. "You terrified me. I had no idea Marcus had a brother. I am so sorry for intruding like this." I did not give them a single chance to respond or invite me further inside. I quickly backed away toward the long hallway. "I just brought some food. It is on the table. I should let you two grieve in peace. I will call you later. Elena." I turned on my heel and walked out the front door, resisting the overwhelming urge to break into a frantic sprint. I climbed into my car, locked the doors instantly, and turned the ignition. As I drove away from that cursed wooden cabin, my heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. The tears that blurred my vision were no longer tears of sympathy, but tears of absolute terror and burning clarity. The game had changed, and I needed to find out exactly what my husband was hiding in the shadows. The drive back to the city was a blur of highway lines and suffocating anxiety. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned completely white. By the time I pulled into the driveway of our suburban home, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the pristine lawn. I sat in the car for 5 long minutes, practicing my breathing, locking the terror away in a dark corner of my mind. I had to become a mirror, reflecting only what my husband expected to see. When I pushed the front door open, the house was submerged in an artificial, melancholic gloom. The lights were dimmed. Soft, mournful classical music drifted from the living room speakers. I found Julian sitting in the center of the plush sofa, holding a silver-framed photograph of him and Marcus taken during a fishing trip 2 summers ago. He was staring at it with red, puffy eyes, gently tracing the glass with his thumb. A half-empty glass of expensive whiskey rested on the coffee table. "I just cannot believe he's really gone." "Aurora," Julian whispered, his voice cracking with a perfectly executed tremor. He looked up at me, a single, crystalline tear rolling down his cheek. A violent wave of pure disgust washed over me, so intense it almost made my stomach heave. I was looking at a monster wearing the skin of the man I loved. He was grieving for a man who was currently sipping dark roast coffee in a forest cabin. I forced my facial muscles into a mask of sympathetic sorrow, crossing the room to wrap my arms around his shoulders. "I know, darling," I murmured, resting my chin against his head while staring blankly at the wall behind him. "It is going to be okay. We will get through this together." Every muscle in my body screamed to pull away from his touch. I closed my eyes, running through a mental catalog of his behavior over the past 12 months. The late nights at the office, the sudden changes in his passwords, the secretive phone calls he took out on the patio. The pieces of a sinister puzzle were finally aligning, and I needed hard evidence. I was no longer a grieving wife. I was an investigator trapped inside a crime scene. Later that evening, the heavy rhythm of the shower running in the master bathroom provided the perfect acoustic cover. I slipped out of bed, moving soundlessly across the carpeted floor to Julian's study. His sleek silver laptop sat on the oak desk alongside his secondary business phone. My background in technology strategy finally had a practical, albeit devastating, application. I pulled a tiny, encrypted flash drive from the bottom of my jewelry box, a tool I had previously used for testing security vulnerabilities at my firm. My heart hammered frantically against my ribs as I plugged the drive into the side of his laptop. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark room with a cold, bluish glow. My fingers flew across the keyboard, executing lines of code to bypass his basic user password. It took exactly 3 minutes to deploy the invisible monitoring software into the root directory of his operating system. The program would quietly clone every keystroke, every downloaded file, and every deleted message, sending the data directly to my private server. I repeated the exact same process with his business phone, intercepting the device's synchronization protocol just as the water shut off in the adjacent bathroom. I slid the devices back into their exact original positions, pulled the flash drive, and darted back to the bedroom, slipping under the heavy duvet mere seconds before Julian opened the door. A towel wrapped around his waist. "You should get some sleep," he said softly, sliding into the bed beside me. "I will try," I replied, turning my back to him. I waited for 2 agonizing hours until his breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Then, I retreated to the basement, locking the soundproof door behind me. I booted up my own workstation, connected to the secure server, and began the digital autopsy of my husband's life. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming, but I filtered the searches with ruthless precision. I started with his communication logs. Beneath layers of standard work emails and spam, my software detected a hidden partition communicating with a virtual private network. I cracked the encryption key using a brute force script, revealing a massive chain of heavily coded messages. Julian was not communicating with a stranger. The syntax, the inside jokes, the specific shorthand abbreviations, they all belonged to Marcus. My eyes scanned the screen rapidly as I cross-referenced the timestamps. These messages did not start after the funeral. They had been flowing consistently for over a year. I dug deeper, accessing the global positioning system history embedded in the cloud backup of his car, the digital map populated with hundreds of red dots, tracing his movements across the state. My blood ran completely cold. For the past 8 months, Julian's vehicle had made weekly, sometimes bi-weekly, trips to the exact geographic coordinates of Elena's isolated wooden cabin. He had been visiting them long before Marcus supposedly suffered his fatal heart attack. The final, crushing blow came when I cracked open a hidden archive folder cleverly disguised as a corrupted system file. Inside, I found a digital ledger of pure betrayal. It contained detailed offshore bank account routing numbers, scanned copies of forged medical death certificates, and a 50-page document outlining every single logistical step required to fake a sudden cardiac arrest. They had planned the funeral expenses, the bribes for the local coroner, and even the specific script Julian would use to deliver the eulogy. They had mapped out this elaborate theatrical production for nearly 365 days. Marcus was not dead. My husband was not grieving. They were partners in a massive, terrifying conspiracy. I sat alone in the dark basement, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my wide, tearless eyes. The Aurora who had baked a chicken and cried at a graveyard was gone forever. A new, icy rationality took her place. I did not just want to leave him. I wanted to burn his entire world to the ground. The basement felt colder than before, the chill seeping through the concrete floor and settling deep into my bones. Finding the fake death logistics was only half the puzzle. I had the how, but I desperately needed the why. Julian was a mid-level financial consultant. And Marcus was a freelance architect. Neither of them possessed the criminal ingenuity to orchestrate a phantom existence just for the thrill of it. Faking a death required immense capital, forged government documents, and a terrifying level of commitment. There had to be a massive financial incentive. And if Julian was stealing, what exactly was he stealing from our seemingly ordinary life? The answer hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. Me. He was stealing from me. My fingers flew across my mechanical keyboard, the loud clacking echoing in the silent, dark room. I established a secure, encrypted tunnel directly into the internal security mainframe of my employer, Nexus Core Innovations. As a senior lead developer, I had top-tier security clearance, but I had never used it to audit my own household. I navigated through the labyrinth of our corporate firewall, bypassing the standard surveillance protocols, and headed straight for the access logs of my personal research vault. For exactly 3 long years, I had poured my absolute soul into a top-secret medical algorithm. It was a revolutionary piece of artificial intelligence designed to predict terminal genetic mutations with an accuracy rate of 99.9% long before physical symptoms ever appeared. It was the undisputed crown jewel of Nexus Core, a breakthrough that would change modern medicine, save countless lives, and generate billions in legitimate corporate revenue. It was my life's work. I pulled up the registry for the algorithm's source code. The screen flashed a terrifying red alert. The system architecture showed a massive, unauthorized data cloning event. Someone had packaged the entire proprietary framework into an untraceable, highly compressed file and bypassed the outbound security filters. I checked the leaked access identification number and cross-referenced the exact timestamp of the devastating breach. My breath caught in my throat, choking me. The date was exactly 45 days ago. The time was 8:15 in the evening. A sickening, vivid memory flooded my mind. We were sitting in our living room. Julian had clumsily spilled a glass of water on his personal laptop. He had seemed so incredibly panicked, begging to borrow my heavily encrypted Nexus Core workstation just for 10 minutes to send a critical client email before a strict corporate deadline. I had unlocked the device for him, trusted him completely, and walked into the kitchen to prepare dinner. In those 10 short minutes, the man I slept next to every single night had robbed me blind, copying 3 years of my blood, sweat, and tears onto a hidden external drive. The pieces of this grotesque puzzle slammed together with violent, undeniable clarity. Marcus faking his own death was not a desperate escape from reality. It was a brilliant, highly calculated tactical maneuver. You cannot arrest a dead man. Interpol cannot track a corpse by legally dying. Marcus became the ultimate, invisible courier. He was completely free from government surveillance, allowing him to take my stolen medical algorithm into the deepest, darkest shadows of the international black market. He could negotiate freely with rogue pharmaceutical cartels or hostile foreign governments without leaving a single digital footprint. I switched back to the cloned data from Julian's hidden files, digging furiously into the financial ledgers. I found the pending transaction codes. They were waiting for a payday that defied all imagination. The documents revealed an impending transfer of tens of millions of dollars. The money was scheduled to be routed through a complex web of shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, bouncing through anonymous banking networks in Eastern Europe, and slowly bleeding back into domestic accounts disguised as legitimate commercial real estate investments. They had built an entire underground financial ecosystem to wash the dirty money. My vision went completely red. A primal, suffocating rage clawed at my throat. My husband had traded my intellect and my entire career for blood money, sacrificing his best friend to the criminal underworld to act as the perfect ghost. But the absolute worst revelation was yet to come. At the very bottom of the encrypted folder, separated from the banking documents and the forged death certificates, was a compressed cache of audio files. They were encrypted voice memos, sent back and forth between the virtual private network and an unknown receiver. I plugged my heavy studio headphones into the jack, needing to hear every single detail. I clicked the play button on the most recent file. expecting to hear Julian's smooth, deceitful tone, or perhaps Marcus's booming, arrogant voice. Instead, a soft, chillingly calm female voice filled my ears. Julian, you need to restructure the third offshore account. The routing protocol is too linear. The federal authorities will flag the sudden influx of wealth if you do not layer it through the dummy corporations I established last week. Marcus is securing the final buyer in Geneva. Do not make any sudden moves with Aurora until the wire transfer clears completely. Keep her happy. Keep her blind. I ripped the headphones off my ears, throwing them onto the wooden desk as if they were physically burning my skin. It was Elena, the weeping, fragile widow I had just visited in the terrifying isolation of the woods, the woman I had spent 2 hours cooking for out of pure, foolish pity. She was not a victim. She was not a collateral casualty swept up in her husband's criminal enterprise. Elena was the mastermind. The audio files painted a terrifying picture of a brilliant, sociopathic puppet master who had carefully manipulated both Julian and Marcus. She was orchestrating the entire money laundering operation, treating my husband and her own like disposable pawn pieces on a bloody chessboard. I sat alone in the freezing basement, surrounded by the glowing monitors that displayed the total, catastrophic destruction of my reality. My husband was a thief. His best friend was a black market smuggler, and the grieving widow was the brilliant architect of my ruin. They thought I was just a naive, predictable workaholic they could exploit and easily discard. They thought I was weak. They were about to learn exactly what happens when you steal the fire from someone who knows exactly how to burn the entire world down. The silence of the house pressed against my ears as I crept up the stairs from the basement. The digital clocks glowed faintly in the dark, reading exactly 3 a.m. My mind was racing, connecting the horrifying dots of my husband's betrayal. But digital ghosts and encrypted audio files were not enough. I needed physical proof of his endgame. I slipped into his study once more, locking the heavy door behind me. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard under his massive oak desk was a small biometric safe. Julian thought I did not know about it, but I had watched him open it months ago, memorizing the backup keypad sequence. It was the year we were married. A sickening irony. I punched in the 4 digits, 2015, and the heavy steel door clicked open. Inside, stacked neatly beneath his spare passports and bundles of emergency cash, was a single, crisp, white envelope. My name was typed across the front. My hands trembled as I broke the seal and pulled out a carefully formatted letter. It was a fabricated declaration of abandonment. It was written entirely in my voice, mimicking my cadence and vocabulary with chilling accuracy. The letter detailed a deep, unbearable emotional breakdown, claiming that the sudden, tragic death of Marcus had broken my spirit beyond repair. The words painted a pathetic picture of a fragile woman who simply could not cope with the grief and had chosen to walk away from her entire life and vanish without a trace to escape the mental agony. I stared at the paper, feeling the blood freeze in my veins. I was not grieving Marcus. I barely tolerated him when he was supposedly alive. Why would Julian write this? How did he plan to execute it without raising suspicion? And then, a horrific memory crashed into my consciousness, stealing the breath right out of my lungs. The coffee. For the past 21 days, Julian had been acting like the perfect, supportive husband, waking up early every single morning to bring me a fresh cup of dark roast coffee in bed. I had noticed a strange, sharp, metallic bitterness lingering at the back of my throat after every sip. When I mentioned it, he smiled warmly and claimed he was just trying a new, exotic blend from South America. A wave of pure nausea washed over me. He was not being loving. He was orchestrating my total erasure. The fabricated letter of abandonment was his insurance policy, a perfectly typed explanation for when the authorities found my side of the closet empty and declared me a voluntary runaway. I carefully placed the forged letter back into the safe, wiping away my fingerprints, and locked the steel door. The sun rose 3 hours later, bringing with it the most terrifying performance of my entire life. Julian walked into the bedroom, carrying a steaming ceramic mug on a wooden tray. He kissed my forehead, his lips feeling like absolute ice against my skin. "Drink up, my love," he whispered, his voice dripping with fake concern. "You need your strength. You look so pale today." "Thank you, darling," I replied, forcing a weak, exhausted smile. "You are too good to me." I waited until he walked into the bathroom and turned on the shower. Then, I scrambled out of bed, pouring the dark liquid into a sterile glass vial I had stolen from my laboratory kit. I replaced the missing coffee with plain tap water, took a small sip to stain my lips, and left the half-empty mug on the nightstand. Later that afternoon, while Julian was at his office pretending to work, I drove across the city to a private, independent toxicology laboratory. I handed the glass vial and a thick envelope containing $1,000 in cash to a discreet chemist, demanding absolute confidentiality and an expedited analysis. I sat in my car for 4 agonizing hours until my burner phone rang. The chemist sounded deeply disturbed. The coffee was laced with a highly potent, unprescribed psychotropic compound. He explained that in small daily doses the chemical would slowly shatter my grip on reality. It would cause chronic insomnia, extreme paranoia, severe disorientation, and severe emotional instability. Within 30 to 40 days, the accumulated drug would trigger a complete psychological collapse. A medical evaluation would show a severe psychotic break brought on by physical and mental exhaustion, perfectly aligning with the tragic narrative of a fragile widow who simply lost her mind and vanished to escape her grief. Julian did not just want to sell my stolen medical algorithm on the black market. He wanted total, undisputed ownership of my life. By killing me slowly, he would legally inherit my entire estate, my massive life insurance policy, and all the corporate patents registered under my name. He would walk away as the tragic hero who lost his best friend and his beloved wife in the same tragic month, pocketing millions in illegal funds while legally acquiring everything I had ever built. A cold, predatory calmness settled over my panic. I was not going to die, and I was certainly not going to let him win. I refused to call the local police department. Julian was too smart. He had undoubtedly prepared alibis, bribed the right officials, and possessed enough money to drag a local investigation through years of legal mud. I needed someone untouchable. When I returned home, I began the greatest acting role of my existence. I poured the poison coffee down the drain every single morning, but I manifested the exact symptoms the neurotoxin was supposed to induce. I used gray makeup under my eyes to simulate chronic exhaustion. I let my hands shake visibly when I held a fork at the dinner table. I spent hours pacing the living room at night, feigning severe insomnia and hysterical crying fits, watching Julian secretly smirk from the shadows, entirely convinced his wicked plan was working perfectly. Behind his back, I used a secure, encrypted terminal to contact a ghost from my past. He was a veteran federal agent operating within the elite economic and high-tech crimes division, a man I had assisted during a massive cybersecurity breach 5 years ago. I sent him the encrypted evidence, the offshore routing numbers, the forged death certificates, and the toxicology report. I was no longer just a victim waiting for the slaughter. I was the architect of their absolute destruction, and I was about to build a cage they could never escape. The federal agent I contacted, a meticulous man named Agent Hayes, did not hesitate when he saw the encrypted cache I sent him. He immediately recognized the sheer scale of the transnational money laundering operation. Within 48 hours, a specialized surveillance team infiltrated my home while Julian was at a mandatory corporate seminar. They worked like ghosts, embedding ultra-high-definition microcameras into the crown molding of our living room, behind the ventilation grate in the master bedroom, and directly inside the spine of a thick dictionary resting on the desk in Julian's office. Every corner of his existence was now streaming live to a secure server at federal headquarters. With the surveillance net perfectly cast, it was time to bait the trap. I needed to force Julian into making a fatal, irreversible move. The opportunity presented itself over a quiet, grim dinner. I sat across from him, my shoulders slumped, my hands trembling violently as I pushed a piece of grilled salmon around my plate. I looked up at him through hollowed, artificially darkened eyes. "Julian," I whispered, my voice barely more than a fragile rasp. "I have made a decision. I cannot keep hiding in this house. The grief is suffocating me. Nexus Corps is hosting their annual Vanguard Gala in exactly 10 days. The executive board wants me to officially unveil the new medical algorithm to the public and the shareholders." Julian froze. His fork hovered inches from his mouth. I could see the gears grinding violently behind his eyes. He slowly lowered his hand, his expression morphing into one of deep, calculated concern. "Are you sure you're strong enough for that, my love?" he asked, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "You have been so weak lately. The doctors said you need strict bed rest." "I have to do this," I replied, squeezing my eyes shut to push out a single, rehearsed tear. "It is the work of my life. Marcus always told me to be proud of it. I want to dedicate the launch to his memory. After the gala, I think I will step down from the company. Take a long leave of absence. Maybe sign over the patent rights to the corporate trust so I do not have to look at the research anymore." I threw the bait right into the bloody water, and he swallowed it whole. The idea of me willingly giving up the legal rights to the algorithm was the exact catalyst he needed. "If that is what you truly want, I will support you completely," he murmured, reaching across the table to squeeze my trembling hand. His palm was warm, but his soul was absolute ice. Later that night, sitting in the absolute darkness of the basement, I watched the live feed from the camera hidden in his office. Julian was practically vibrating with toxic excitement. He believed the neurotoxin had finally broken my spirit. He believed I was going to publicly validate the algorithm, thereby maximizing its value on the black market, and then conveniently step away, or die from a sudden heart failure shortly after. The camera zoomed in on his computer monitor. He opened a secure browser and purchased 2 one-way first-class airline tickets. The departure date was set for the exact night of the Vanguard Gala, scheduled to take off at exactly midnight. The destination was a private airstrip in Zurich, Switzerland. The passenger names were Julian Bennett and Elena Vaughn. He was planning to watch me collapse on stage, slip away in the ensuing chaos, and fly across the ocean to join his wealthy, sociopathic mistress and her fake dead husband. The sheer arrogance of his plan was breathtaking. While Julian packed his imaginary bags for Europe, I spent the next 9 days solidifying the legal cage that would bury them all. Agent Hayes and his team of forensic accountants followed the digital breadcrumbs I had extracted from the hidden server. They traced the massive influx of $50 million from a rogue pharmaceutical syndicate in Eastern Europe directly into the offshore shell accounts controlled by Elena. We had irrefutable proof of wire fraud, grand larceny, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to commit murder. The federal authorities secured preemptive arrest warrants for everyone involved. They flagged the overseas bank accounts, preparing to freeze the stolen funds the second Julian and Marcus attempted to access them. We even tracked the exact location of the secluded cabin where Marcus was hiding, assigning a heavily armed tactical response unit to wait quietly in the surrounding woods until the exact moment I gave the signal. Every single detail was perfectly orchestrated. Julian continued to serve me his poison coffee every morning, smiling his wicked smile. I continued to pour it down the drain, smiling back with the cold, dead eyes of a predator. I let him pick out my elegant black dress for the gala. I let him rehearse the emotional speech he planned to give to the press when my heart supposedly failed. He thought he was the ultimate hunter, cornering a weak, grieving widow. He had absolutely no idea that the entire world around him had been transformed into an invisible, inescapable noose. The board was set. The pieces were locked in place. The Vanguard Gala was going to be the biggest night of the year, but the world was not going to witness a medical breakthrough. They were going to witness an absolute massacre. The grand ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel was a sea of blinding chandeliers and shimmering evening gowns. Thousands of the top technological innovators, medical experts, and elite journalists from across the United States gathered for the annual Vanguard Gala. The air buzzed with the low hum of clinking champagne glasses and hushed, excited conversations. They were all waiting for the unveiling of the century. They were waiting for me. I stood behind the heavy velvet curtain, taking one final, deep breath. Through the narrow slit in the fabric, I could see Julian sitting in the front row center. He was dressed in a pristine black tuxedo, looking like the ultimate grieving widower who had bravely accompanied his dying wife to her final triumph. I watched him glance at his expensive watch. He was counting down the minutes. According to his twisted timeline, the accumulated neurotoxin should be shutting down my organs right now. He was waiting for me to stumble out, deliver a weak speech, and collapse into the grave he had dug for me. The announcer called my name, and the massive auditorium erupted into thunderous applause. I did not stumble. I did not shake. I pushed the heavy velvet curtain aside and strode into the blinding spotlight with absolute, unyielding power. I had washed the gray makeup from my face. I wore a striking crimson-red gown that moved like liquid fire around my legs. My posture was straight, my head held high. The sick, fragile woman Julian had created was dead. The woman walking across that stage was a titanium wall. I stopped at the transparent podium and looked directly down at Julian. The smug, victorious smile on his face instantly melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. His jaw visibly tightened. He knew something was terribly wrong, but he was completely trapped under the gaze of thousands of industry leaders. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I spoke into the microphone, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with crystal-clear authority. "Tonight, Nexus Core Innovations promised you a revolution in medical algorithms, a system designed to detect deadly anomalies hidden in the dark. But before we look at the future of medicine, I need to demonstrate exactly how efficiently my system detects a terminal parasite." The crowd fell into a stunned silence. They expected scientific charts. They expected corporate buzzwords. Instead, I raised the small black remote control in my hand and firmly pressed the main button. The gigantic digital screen behind me did not display a slideshow. It flickered violently and then locked onto a high-definition, live security feed. It was the interior of Elena's isolated wooden cabin. The camera angle was perfectly positioned above the kitchen. There, in full color and perfect clarity, was the tragically deceased Marcus. He was sitting comfortably at the kitchen island, wearing an expensive silk robe, casually swirling a glass of red wine while laughing at something off-screen. A collective, deafening gasp ripped through the entire ballroom. Hundreds of cameras flashed simultaneously. Journalists scrambled for their recording devices. The man they had all mourned, the man whose obituary had dominated the tech news networks for weeks, was sitting right there on the screen, breathing and drinking. "That is Marcus, the man my husband supposedly buried 30 days ago," I announced, my voice cutting through the rising chaos in the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. I clicked the remote again. The screen split into multiple windows. "And this is the massive international money laundering operation he has been running with my husband." Massive financial ledgers filled the display. I showed the exact timestamp of the security breach at Nexus Core. I showed the source code of my medical algorithm being illegally transferred. I showed the routing numbers for the $50 million transaction funneling into offshore accounts in Switzerland. "Julian Bennett stole 3 years of my life's work to sell on the black market," I continued, my voice rising in volume and intensity. "He orchestrated a fake death to create a ghost courier, and when I became a liability, he decided to eliminate me." I hit the final button. The toxicology report flashed across the entire 40-foot screen, highlighting the lethal synthetic neurotoxin in bright red ink. Next to it was the forged suicide note he had kept in his safe. "For the past 3 weeks, my husband has been poisoning my morning coffee with a fatal neurotoxin, planning to inherit my entire estate and walk away with $50 million. Total pandemonium erupted. People were screaming. Reporters were shouting questions. Julian finally snapped. The illusion of his control shattered completely. His face contorted into a mask of pure animalistic rage. He vaulted over the front row barrier, screaming my name with a guttural roar, charging directly toward the stage stairs. He barely made it 3 steps. From the shadows of the VIP tables, 6 men and women in formal evening wear suddenly moved with terrifying speed. Agent Hayes and his undercover federal squad descended on Julian like a pack of wolves. They tackled him to the carpeted floor with a sickening thud. Julian thrashed violently, screaming obscenities, but they pinned his arms behind his back, locking heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists right in front of the flashing cameras of the national press. "Look at the screen. Julian," I commanded, my voice booming through the speakers over his pathetic screams. "Watch your empire burn." The massive display shifted its feed. It connected directly to the tactical satellite uplink Agent Hayes had prepared. The live feed showed the dark forest surrounding the cabin. Suddenly, the front door of the wooden house was blown completely off its hinges. Heavily armored tactical teams swarmed into the living room. The camera caught Elena screaming in sheer terror as she was thrown against the wall. Marcus dropped his glass of wine, raising his hands in absolute surrender as 4 laser sights locked onto his chest. Behind them, on the dining table, were open briefcases stuffed with thousands of $100 bills. They had been mere hours away from their flight to Zurich. Now, they were going to spend the rest of their natural lives in a federal concrete cage. The ballroom was absolute madness, a cacophony of sirens, flashing lights, and shouting journalists. But standing there on the podium, I felt an overwhelming, beautiful wave of absolute peace. The storm had broken. The poison was gone. I stepped away from the microphone and walked slowly down the short flight of stage stairs. The sea of people parted for me, their faces painted with a mixture of shock, awe, and deep respect. I reached the bottom step where Julian was currently being dragged to his feet by 2 massive federal agents. His tuxedo was torn. His face was pressed against the floor just seconds before. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with desperate, pleading panic. He looked like a pathetic, broken little boy. I did not scream at him. I did not spit on him. I simply offered him a cold, terrifying smile that promised decades of misery. I stepped right past him, the hem of my crimson dress brushing against his expensive leather shoes. I walked out of the ballroom and into the cool, fresh night air, stepping out of the shadows of his deceit to finally reclaim total, undisputed ownership of my brilliant life. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Violet Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.